Hello and welcome, audience and panelists. I'd like to thank all of you taxpayers and politically invested individuals for joining us today for our debate in regards to whether or not welfare recipients should be mandatorily drug tested. My name is Elise Levan. I have been a professional moderator for 5 years now, and I will be leading today's discussion. I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, we have Madison Collier. She is a lobbyist, and she is for the debate. Next, we have Harrison Olson, who is a lawyer, and he is similarly for the drug testing of welfare recipients. Next, we have Nikisha Iannicho, who is a doctor, and she's neutral in her stance. For our last two panelists, we have Logan Hoff, who is an ethics professor here at St. Edward's, and he's against the drug testing of welfare recipients. And last, but certainly not least, we have Lily Bruner, who is an ex-convict, and she is also against the debate. Before we go ahead and get started, I'd like to lay a couple of ground rules for our panelists as well as our audience. Audience, please hold all of your questions until the very end, where we will have a question and answer session up to 10 minutes. Panelists, please be respectful of one another and each other's viewpoints. Please don't interrupt each other, and please only speak when I address you. So I'd like to go ahead right into our first question, who I'm going to direct to Madison. Madison, can you please identify your stance and go ahead and elaborate on your position?
My name is Madison. I'm a lobbyist for drug testing of welfare recipients, and from a financial standpoint, I think it's really important to recognize both the cost and savings of this movement. I think it's important for taxpayers to be aware of where their money is going, and although a small percentage of welfare recipients are involved in drug use, I think that none of the money that is spent should be wasted on individuals who are abusing the program. I think that the annual savings and application of the money that would be saved could be put to use for the programs to help individuals who are struggling with drug use, because there's a lot of funding that has been cut from these programs, and we could extract extra funding from the welfare that is not being distributed to individuals who have been found positive in the drug testing. And it's also important to put people before profits. We need to support those who are found to have problems with drugs, not just punish them by denying them welfare. It's an incentive for them to get help and also to get on the right path so that they are able to receive that support from the state.
All right, thank you, Madison. I would also like to add in before we continue that there will be a total of 2 questions. The first question, like you did, it will be 3 minutes, and the second question, which will be the last question, will be 2 minutes. So to continue, Harrison, can you please also identify your stance and elaborate on your position?
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Harrison. I'm a lawyer who graduated from Harvard Law. I specialize in privacy-specified cases, meaning that any cases that have to do with privacy law is what I usually handle with. Now, I am for the drug testing of welfare recipients, and I know that a big argument against this is because it's an invasion of privacy. One of the big arguments, the reason that argument is a big one is because it's supported specifically by the Fourth Amendment rights. And if you don't mind, I'll just read you guys exactly what that is, so you're aware of it. It's a little dry, bear with me for just a second. So the Fourth Amendment rights are the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall be issued, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describe the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Now, this wording can be very confusing for some people to understand, but this does not necessarily mean that we cannot drug test welfare recipients. This doesn't allow them to back out of being drug tested. The reason being is that unlike many of what our arguments are going to be against testing welfare recipients, on my side, we have to look at it as you're entering a contract with the federal government to accept federal funds as help to get back on your feet. And for that acceptance, we require that you pass a drug test, that you do not test positive. Everything else is not part of what I do. I specifically focus on the fact that if you're accepting the government's contract of accepting federal funds, you must pass a drug test.
Okay, thank you, Harrison. Dr. Iannicho, I'd like to ask you a similar question. Can you please identify your stance and elaborate on your position as well?
Good afternoon, everyone. As Elise said, I am Dr. Hamicho. My stance is neutral. While I don't disagree with my colleagues on testing, I also am not sure if the testing is a way that we should go. Here's my deal. If you are going to test welfare recipients, then you need to be fair across the board. If you're going to say, we're going to test welfare recipients because they are receiving money from the federal government, then we need to test those that are sitting in Congress. We need to test doctors that are working for the government. Anybody that's receiving funding from the federal government should be tested. And so I stand neutral because I don't know, or I don't see right now where this is fair across the board.
All right, thank you, Nikisha. Next, Logan, can you please identify your stance and elaborate on your position?
Hello, my name is Logan, and again, I am an ethics professor here at St. Edward's. And my main argument is that it is unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment. And U.S. District Court Judge Victoria Roberts from Michigan found it to be unconstitutional, and she believed the rationale behind it could be used for testing the parents of all children who receive Medicaid, state emergency relief, education grants or loans, or public education or any other benefits from the states. So the ACLU took them to court and pretty much knocked them down. Another argument of mine is that it's unethical to waste taxpayer dollars when the majority of citizens, the general population, use drugs just as much as welfare recipients. The National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism did a study and found that those illegal drug use among those receiving welfare and those that are not receiving welfare is significantly or statistically insignificant. And for example, in Tennessee, 8% of the general population has admitted to drug use in the past 8 years, in the past month, sorry. Yet when they ran their program, they found only 0.12% of the applicants tested positive.
Okay, thank you, Logan. Last, Lily, can you please also identify your stance and elaborate on your position?
Hi, my name is Lily, and I, as a former heroin addict and former convict, am arguing against the drug testing for potential welfare recipients on grounds of incarceration-related points. By requiring welfare recipients to submit to drug testing, which violates one of their constitutional rights, we are perpetuating the caustic criminalization of substance abuse rather than treating it as the cry for help that it actually is. Drug testing for welfare recipients is preemptively punitive, and it is up to us to combat that rather than endorse it. According to the Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse, more than 65% of inmates in the United States, which is approximately 2.3 million people currently incarcerated, have admitted to using drugs or are meeting all of the criteria to be considered addicted to a certain substance. So they're all, like 65% of those people are suffering from addiction, pardon me. Let's see. I want to read off a few more facts for you from CASA Columbia, which is the Columbia University's, I want to say it's their science group that's devoted to collecting statistics on addiction and substance abuse. Let's see. 80% of defendants can't afford a lawyer, so that's something that's really important. War on drugs traditionally targets low-income dealers on the streets rather than high-income suppliers, which means that half the time people who are incarcerated for drug use or drug-affiliated crimes are only targeted because they're low income. 53% of incarcerated persons earned less than $10,000 a year prior to their incarceration. And approximately 75% of the states enforce a ban on receiving welfare due to drug conviction, according to what's called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which is called PRAWORA for short. And it's essentially a ban on welfare benefits for persons convicted of drug-related felonies. And so, to reiterate, I feel as a former convict and former heroin addict that it is not conducive to the well-being of the country, especially those of a lower class economically, to continue to drug test for welfare.
Okay, thank you. So for our second and last question, I'm going to go ahead and start with Madison. Madison, how, in your opinion, if you can you justify drug testing?
I think with drug testing, there are a few aspects to keep in mind with welfare recipients. For people who are not on welfare, there are often standards of employment for companies. It's very common for companies to drug test their employees. Professional athletes have to be drug tested. Military personnel have to be drug tested, all to ensure that they keep their position and receive their paycheck. Welfare recipients are asking for money, for assistance from the government, and I think that it is perfectly fair to expect the same from them, to hold them to the same standards as the working class. There's also a wait list for welfare, and I believe that it's really important to keep those who are on the wait list moving up, moving forward, and if that means that individuals who are not following the rules and who are not doing what they should to receive the money are no longer able to do so, I think that that's fair. These programs need to be funded, but I think that it's important to keep the priority on people before profit, as I said. It's important to support the people who are doing what they should and to try and get those who have addiction help, and that is why I'm for drug testing for welfare recipients.
Thank you, Madison. Last, Harrison, this is your last question as well. Is drug testing for welfare random, universal, or with cause, in your opinion?
Okay, so as far as we can tell so far, most states have chosen one of the three basic ideas, whether it be with cause, random, or universal. Now the reasons for this is purely up to the state, whereas we see Arizona has enacted their version of drug testing on welfare, but theirs is strictly random. They drug test at random. They take a random number of people and they select whoever comes out of basically an algorithmic function. And the next big example would be Wisconsin. They've chosen to do a universal approach, meaning that everybody who goes through the welfare program gets tested. Now, in my opinion, the best way to do a drug testing for welfare, to make it the easiest, as agreeing with the doctor, is that we have to make sure it's universal. We have to make sure everybody who's entering the program gets tested, and not just specific people or per se with cause. And that is why Michigan was actually struck down with their drug testing on their welfare program, was because they were testing with cause. So they would take individuals who they thought were directly violating the drug addiction or testing policies, and they would say, we're going to drug test you and make sure that you're negative. But if you come back positive, then it's over. And that led for a very good basis on the Fourth Amendment. However, if you do a universal drug testing approach, you're not going to violate the Fourth Amendment. It's just not applicable to that approach.
Thank you, Harrison. Nikisha, your last question. Because you are a medical professional, I'd like to ask you, how do you exactly determine who gets drug tested?
Well, as a doctor, we can't determine who gets tested and who doesn't get tested. What we are concerned about are the false positive. Now, many of you already know that there are going to be people that are on welfare that are taking other kinds of medications for other medical reasons. So what happens when you test these individuals and it comes back a false positive because of the medication that they're already on? So that's number one. The second thing is what happens with this information. Once you have tested them, whether they come out positive or negative, what are we doing with this information? Are you using this information to help the individuals that you found out are positive? Are you using this information to stop those that you found out that were positive from getting their checks? What is happening with this information? Because we don't hold on to it. As a doctor, you don't hold on to that information. So we are concerned along those lines. Again, as I stated before, we're definitely concerned about the fairness of it. We're definitely concerned about the false positive, and we're concerned about this information that's being collected on individuals. So again, that is why I stand neutral on drug testing welfare recipients.
All right, thank you, Dr. Yahancho. Logan, for your last question, I would like to ask you, which states, if any, have already implemented this drug testing for welfare recipients?
So far, there have been at least 13 states that have implemented drug testing. Those include Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Kansas, Michigan, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Utah. And among those, it's worth mentioning that Florida, they tested whether or not it would be in their financial interest, and they found that only 2.6% of their applicants would test positive, but in the end it would still result in them losing a lot of money.
Okay, thank you, Logan. Lily, your last question, I would like to ask you, in your opinion, do you see drug use as a criminal offense?
Absolutely not. Drug addiction and substance abuse, I should say, is a disease, and oftentimes people who are substance abusers are actually victims of other mental or social disorders, and they lack the funding necessary to acquire treatment for that. So they're suffering through their symptoms and the disorder themselves without actually having the things that they need in order to move past it. And so oftentimes they turn to alcohol or substances to cope with these symptoms, which can oftentimes be debilitating otherwise. So I think that it is absolutely not a criminal offense that we're sort of perpetuating.
Okay, thank you, Lily. So thank you, everyone. That will be our last question in our debate in regards to whether or not welfare recipients should be drug tested. I'd like to just go ahead and quickly recap. We have Madison Collier. She was for the debate, and she discussed the cost and savings that it would provide. Next, we have Harrison Olson, who was also for the debate, and he discussed a lot about the Fourth Amendment and the rights of citizens. We have Dr. Yahancho, who was neutral in her stance, and her opinion was, who really does get tested? How do you determine that line? For our last two panelists, Logan Hoff, he was against, and he spoke about how it was just very unconstitutional to drug test these types of recipients. And lastly, Lily, she was also against, and she spoke about more the stigma around it and how drug use may be a cry for help. So, in conclusion, I would like to thank all of the audience and all of our panelists for joining us today. We will be having our question and answer session, which we can take up to 10 minutes for. So thank you. And we're going to go ahead and start that.
What state has the most successful welfare drug testing program so far?
Okay, so what state has the most successful drug testing program so far?
Welfare drug testing.
Okay, I'd like to direct that question to Harrison. Would you like to go ahead and answer that, please?
Sure, thank you. So far, of the 13 states that have enacted it and the countless others that have it going through Senate, the most successful has been Arizona. They've managed managed to do it at the best cost to, I guess you'd say, catch ratio, where they're able to still identify those who need help and not overspend. There have been states, Oklahoma is a great example, where they had a pretty good catch number where they would get so many people who tested positive, but they spent an absurd amount of taxpayer money on it. So far, Arizona seems to be the best program that has come through. Now, I believe Texas is trying to push through their own program right now, and they're going to use a universal approach, and I'll be curious to see how that one pans out, if it can get pushed through the Senate. Also, Wisconsin, once they push theirs through, theirs will most likely probably topple Arizona, because they'll do a very universal approach that'll also cover some of the lower level social workers. So I believe that is, again, I believe Arizona is the best program right now. I think there are some more coming down the pipeline though that will be better.
Okay, thank you, Harrison, and thank you for your question. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question for Lily. What do you think is responsible for the ongoing perception of substance abuse as a criminal offense?
Okay, so Lily, who do you think is responsible?
Yeah.
Who do you think is responsible, for the drug use of?
Okay, I don't think that there really is a who responsible for that perpetuation. I think that it is commonly accepted that drugs are bad and crime is bad, and somewhere along the line there was this misalignment that really secured drug use as a villainous offense, and that along the line what might have just been a problem has turned into something that really needs to be frowned upon, but not in a way that is beneficial to the person who's suffering from it, but is actually harmful to society as a whole, because it fills up our prisons and it doesn't give people the help they need, and I just think that it really secured the stigma.
All right, thank you. Any more questions?
How much money is spent on welfare?
Okay, I'd like to direct that question to Madison. How much money is spent on welfare?
Welfare typically takes up between a quarter and a third of a state's individual budget. And for Texas alone, the budgeted amount for 2015 was $8.9 billion. So it's quite a bit of the state's budget.
Go ahead.
I have two questions. My first question is, what if someone gets welfare tested, tests negative, and then later on they start using drugs? How does that change?
So if somebody tests negative and then later on they start using drugs, how does that change?
Yes.
I'd like to direct that question to Dr. Hanshaw.
Okay. From what I understand right now, if you are tested and you're negative, then you're fine. If you're, and like you said, if you start using drugs later on and you're tested again, at this stage of the game, they don't take your money from you. They actually try to get you help. But there is coming a point where if you're found to be positive, they're going to take your funding for a year. In that year process, they will get help. You will be able to go through a substance abuse program, and after that year, if you're found to be negative again, then you receive your funding again. Does that answer your question? Okay.
And my second question is, what about fear of discrimination? Who decides which recipients get tested and who don't?
Okay, so the fear of discrimination, how do you determine, really that line between who would get tested and who would not get tested? I'd like to direct that question to Lily. Lily, how do you feel about that?
The states that have welfare programs in place and drug testing for those welfare programs are currently saying that there is no discrimination, that all welfare recipients are equally subjected to the drug testing in order to receive welfare. With that being said, there might actually be some discrimination, but it's never institutional. It's usually at the jurisdiction of people who are administering the tests, and not so much as like an institutional establishment for discrimination. They don't pick and choose. It's supposed to be universal or random.
there any more questions that we can answer? All right, well, in that case, thank you panelists for furthering expressing your opinions and answering those questions. And once again, thank you audience.